The air in the slave pen was a solid thing, a thick broth of unwashed bodies, despair and the ever-present, coppery tang of old blood. Elara breathed it in like a punishment, each gasp a reluctant admission that she was still alive. Her chains' crude bands of pitted iron bolted to the stone floor, allowed her just enough movement to slump against the damp wall or lie on the thin layer of filthy straw. That was her bed. Around her, the sounds of the fortress were a constant, brutal symphony, the guttural shouts of the orcs, the clash of metal, the deep, percussive thump-thump-thump of something massive and mechanical that vibrated through the very rock beneath her. It was the heartbeat of this place, a place the green-skinned brutes called Da Crush. She had been a cartographer's apprentice in the river town of Stillwater. The raid had been a whirlwind of fire, splintering wood and monstrous green faces. She remembered the smell of them most of all, a pungent, fungal stench like a forest floor after a rain, but mixed with raw meat and violence. They hadn't killed everyone. The strong, the young, the unbroken. They were chained and marched for days into the jagged, ashen peaks of the Cinderstone Mountains. Da Crush was their destination, a fortress carved into the heart of the mountain itself, a monument to pure ugly functionality. The orcs were not subtle creatures. They were massive, muscle-bound things with slab-like teeth and small, piggy eyes that glinted with a singular joy for destruction. Their language was a series of grunts, bellows, and crudely formed words. But Elara, sharp-eared and a quick study, had begun to pick up fragments. She learned the word for human, umi, the word for food, squig, the word for work, work, and the word that sent a fresh chill down her spine every time she heard it, a word spoken with a particular, grinding satisfaction by the orc overseers, Rikikul. It wasn't said like a word about conservation or efficiency. It was a promise of something final. Her first week, a man named Kale, a blacksmith from Stillwater, had finally snapped. His spirit, once as strong as the steel he forged, had been worn down by the relentless labor and the casual cruelty. He'd thrown a rock at an overseer, a hulking orc named Grisgut with a rusted hook for a hand and a single, yellowed tusk. Grisgut hadn't even flinched. He'd just chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. This one got fire, he'd grunted to another orc. Good, da. Grindus liked to fire, makes the soup spicy. Kale had been dragged away, not to the punishment pits or the fighting rings Elara had heard whispers of, but down, deeper into the mountain, towards the source of the relentless thump-thump-thump. He never came back. A day later, the slop they were fed, a lukewarm, gray gruel, had a new, faint metallic aftertaste. Elara had noticed it first, her senses heightened by hunger and fear. She'd mentioned it to an old woman, Lyra, who shared her chain gang. Lyra's eyes, clouded with cataracts, had filled with a deep, knowing terror. She'd just shaken her head, her lips moving in a silent prayer. They don't waste anything, child, she'd whispered finally. Not even us. That was when Elara truly understood recycle. It wasn't about repurposing scrap metal or old tools. It was about them. The slaves, their bodies, their energy, their very essence. Nothing was wasted in Da Crush. The horror of it was a cold stone in her gut. Death was one thing. The story spoke of orcs as mindless butchers, and that was a terror she could comprehend, but this was a systematic industrial consumption. It stripped death of its finality, turning it into a mere phase in a continuous gruesome cycle. You didn't just die here. You were processed. Her chainmates were a sorry lot. There was Bren, a young farmer whose broad shoulders were now stooped with exhaustion. There was Pala, a weaver whose clever fingers were now raw and bleeding from moving rock. And there was old man Hem, who barely spoke anymore, just stared at the wall with vacant eyes. They were all skeletons draped in rags, their humanity slowly being scoured away by hunger and hopelessness. Elara clung to her memories. The clean lines of a map, the smell of ink and parchment, the quiet order of her master's study. It was a world away, a dream that grew fainter with every passing day in this waking nightmare. The heavy iron door of the pen screeched open, and the hulking form of Grisgut filled the frame. The other slaves flinched, pulling their chains taut in a futile effort to shrink away. Grisgut's single eye swept over them, a butcher inspecting livestock. Work time, Umis, he bellowed, his voice echoing in the confined space. The boss wants to new shoot us. More Daka! So you lot get to move into Green Rock. Green Rock was what they called the strange, glowing ore they mined from the deepest tunnels. It was heavy, slightly warm to the touch, and pulsed with a faint, sickly light. Handling it made Alara's teeth ache and her skin crawl. The orcs prized it above all else, feeding it into their clanking, smoke-belching forges. As they were unchained from the floor and linked together for the work detail, Alara's eyes met Bren's. The farmer's boy had a spark of defiance left, a flicker of the man he used to be. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. In this place, any shred of solidarity was a lifeline. They were marched through the cavernous halls of Decrush. The architecture was a nightmare of brute force. Rough-hewn stone, massive iron supports driven haphazardly into the rock, and tangled webs of pipes that hissed steam and dripped foul-smelling liquids. Orcs everywhere. Bigger ones bedecked in scrap metal armor shouting orders, smaller runtier ones scrambling to obey. The air was thick with the reek of ozone, fungus, and hot metal, and always underneath it all the thump-thump-thump. It grew louder as they descended a long, sloping tunnel towards the mines. The vibrations made the loose stones on the floor tremble. Alara saw a group of orc engineers, their hides stained with oil and soot, gathered around a massive pipe that emerged from a sealed archway. The pipe, wide enough for a man to crawl through, pulsed rhythmically in time with the grinding beat. A thick greenish viscous liquid sloshed within it, visible through a thick glass porthole. One of the engineers tapped the porthole with a wrench. Looking a bit thin, Dad Batch, he grumbled. Needs more Zog and Yumi, I reckon. More bone. Alara felt her blood run cold. She looked away, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Don't think. Just move, just survive. The mine shaft was a gaping maw in the mountain's gut. The air here was thick with crystalline dust that glittered in the light of the torches, each speck infused with the same faint green glow as the ore. Their job was simple, backbreaking and terrifying. They were to load the larger chunks of green rock onto crude iron carts, which smaller whip-wielding orcs would then push away towards the forges. As Alara strained to lift a heavy lump of the ore, her fingers brushing its unnaturally warm surface, she noticed something, veined through the rock, almost like fossilized threads, were thin, brittle strands of a white material. At first she thought it was quartz, but then she saw a familiar shape, a tiny, delicate chain fused into the greenstone. A necklace, and caught within the glowing matrix a flash of something else. A human tooth. The green rock wasn't just mined. It was grown, and it was fed by the Rikikul. She dropped the rock with a clatter, earning a sharp crack from an overseer's whip across her shoulders. The pain was a bright, sharp flare, but it was nothing compared to the psychic shock of her realization. The mountain itself was consuming them. Their bodies, their bones, their very history were being digested and transformed into fuel for the orc war machine. That night, back in the pen, the metallic taste in the gruel was unmistakable. It was Kale. It was the blacksmith from 2 cells over who had collapsed yesterday. It was everyone who had ever been dragged away. Their essence distilled into this foul sustenance to keep the rest of them working, just a little longer. Bren sat down beside her, his bowl untouched. His face was pale. You taste it too? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Alara could only nod, her throat constricted. Lyra says, she says they call it da soup. Bren continued, his eyes wide with revulsion. She says it's what keeps the grindas turning. The thing that makes the thump-thump. The grindas, Alara repeated the word Grisgut had used. The grinders. It was a perfect, horrifying name. We can't stay here, Alara, Bren said, his voice dropping even lower. This isn't just slavery, this is being eaten, slowly, from the inside out. How? Alara gestured with her chin at the heavy door, the guards beyond. We're chained to a floor inside a mountain full of monsters. I don't know, Bren admitted, his shoulders slumping. But there has to be a way. There has to be. I'd rather die fighting than end up as seasoning for this cursed soup. Alara looked at the gray gruel in her bowl. She thought of the green rock, threaded with the bones of the dead. She thought of the pulsing pipe and the orc's casual comment. Needs more umi, more bone. Bren was right. This was a fate worse than death. This was unbeing. The total eradication of oneself, recycled into the machinery of their oppressors. She made a decision then, a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in her chest. She would not be recycled. She would find a way out, or she would find a way to break the machine. The thump, thump, thump was no longer just the heartbeat of the fortress. It was a countdown, the ticking of a clock measuring out the last moments of her humanity, and she was determined to stop it before her time ran out. Chapter 2. The next few days were a study in a new, refined kind of hell. Every clang of a hammer, every shouted orc command, every tremor from the deep was now a piece of a horrifying puzzle Ilara was desperately trying to solve. She was a cartographer by training. Her mind sought patterns, connections, the logic of a place. But the logic of Dekrush was a madness of consumption and conversion. She started paying closer attention to the rhythms of the fortress. The work details, the guard changes, the flow of materials. The green rock from the mines went to the forges on the upper levels. The waste, the slag, the broken tools. The scraps was collected by grots, the cowering, smaller greenskins, and dumped into chutes that descended into the mountain's depths. And the slaves who were too injured, too sick, or too rebellious were taken down towards the Grindis. She also watched the orcs themselves. Their society was a brutal hierarchy of size, strength, and loudness. The bigger, louder, and more heavily armored an orc was, the more authority it wielded. Their technology was a bizarre paradox, a jumble of rusted scrap, exposed wiring, and leaking pipes that somehow, defying all known laws of physics, worked. It ran on a combination of brute force, belief, and the strange properties of the green rock. She saw an orc mechanic kick a stalled engine while shouting, "Work! You zoggin' piece of junk!" And the thing shuddered back to life with a belch of black smoke. It was as if their collective will, their sheer orcness, warped reality around them. This was both a terrifying and a potentially useful insight. The orcs believed their machines worked, so they did. What if someone could introduce a flaw in that belief? A seed of doubt? Her opportunity to explore this came unexpectedly. During a grueling shift hauling scrap metal, a section of the rickety gantry they were on collapsed. Bren, showing a flash of his old strength, shoved Ilara and Pella clear as the rusted iron gave way. He fell with a cry, disappearing into a pile of jagged debris 10 feet below. The orc overseers roared with laughter. "Clumsy Umi," one guffawed. Ilara scrambled to the edge. "Bren!" He was alive, but his leg was bent at a sickening angle, a shard of bone protruding through the skin. His face was a mask of pain. This was a death sentence. An injured slave was a useless slave, and useless slaves were fed to the Grindis. Grisket stomped over, his hook hand glinting. "What's this?" A broken Umi? He peered down at Bren, his single eye narrowing. "Ain't worth the squig food now. Time for recycle." Two smaller orcs began climbing down into the pit to retrieve him. Panic seized Ilara. It was happening. Right now. She couldn't let them take Bren. He was the only person left who felt real, who remembered a world outside this mountain. "Wait!" she shouted, the word torn from her throat. Grisket turned, surprised. Umis didn't usually speak unless spoken to. "What, little Umi? You want to go with him?" "He's strong," Ilara said, her mind racing. "A good worker. His leg can be fixed. I can fix it." It was an insane gamble. She had no medical knowledge beyond basic field dressings. Grisket stared at her, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would just backhand her into the pit with Bren. Then a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "You fix him? With what, Umi magic?" The other orcs chuckled. With tools," Ilara said, gesturing wildly at the scrap pile. "I can make a splint. Set the bone. If he dies, you lose a strong back. If I fix him, you keep him. It's efficient. Good recycle of his strength, not just his body." She used their word. She appealed to their twisted sense of economy. Grisket was silent, processing this. The orc mind was simple, but it understood utility. Wasting a potentially good worker was, in its own way, unorky. Fine, Grisket grunted finally. You have till tomorrow. If he ain't walking, you both go into soup. And we'll use your bones for toothpicks. He barked a laugh and stomped away, leaving the two orcs to haul Bren's writhing form out of the pit. They were dragged not back to the main pen, but to a side chamber near the forges, a foul-smelling alcove that served as a sort of infirmary for the more valuable slave laborers. It was a place of horrors, filled with the moans of the dying and the grim implements of orky medicine, mostly large hammers and rusty saws. Ilara was given a ragged length of cloth and two relatively straight pieces of scrap metal. It was hopeless. She had no idea what she was doing. Bren was sweating, his breath coming in short, pained gasps. Ilara, you shouldn't have. Be quiet, she ordered, her voice trembling. She cleaned the wound as best she could with a little filthy water, trying to ignore the stark white of the bone. She had to set it. The memory of a map of human anatomy from her master's library flashed in her mind. The femur, the strongest bone in the body. She looked at Bren. This is going to hurt. He clenched his jaw and nodded, tears of pain streaming down his face. She pulled. Bren screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed in the small chamber. Using all her strength, she maneuvered the bone back beneath the skin. A grotesque and bloody task. She wrapped the leg tightly with the cloth and used the metal scraps to splint it, tying them off with strips torn from her own tunic. When it was done, she was covered in his blood, and Bren had passed out from the agony. She slumped against the wall, exhausted, her hands shaking. She had no idea if it would work. Infection was almost certain, but she had bought them a day. A single precious day. As she sat there in the semi-darkness, she heard two orc mechanics talking nearby, their voices carrying through a vent in the rock. "But a big Grinda's making a funny noise," one said. "A whining sound, like it's hungry." "It's always hungry," the other replied. "But Boss Zogwart says we ain't got enough Yumis this week." "Da last batch from the raid was scrawny. Not enough good meat on 'em. Da soup is weak. Weak soup makes weak ducka," the first orc said gravely, as if stating a fundamental law of the universe. "We needs a proper raid. A big un. Lots of fat Umis. Soon, but for now we gotta make do. Check the filters on the intake. Might be clogged with hair and teeth again. Always gets clogged." Ilara's blood ran cold. Intake. Filters. Clogged with hair and teeth. The casual technical discussion of horror. The Grindas weren't just a metaphorical concept. They were a mechanical apparatus with parts that needed maintenance. It was a machine designed for rendering. And Boss Zogwart, that must be the leader of the Crush, the architect of this entire nightmare. Bren stirred, moaning softly. Ilara moved to his side, placing a hand on his forehead. He was burning with fever. The infection was setting in already. She had until tomorrow. If his fever didn't break, if he couldn't stand. They were both destined for the intake, destined to become a clog in the filter, a bit of bone in the green rock, a metallic aftertaste in the gruel. She looked around the infirmary. In the corner, she saw a pile of discarded items taken from slaves. A few buttons, a broken comb, a small water-stained notebook. Her cartographer's heart leapt. Knowledge, a map. Waiting for the orc guard to look away, she scrambled over and snatched the notebook, hiding it in the folds of her rags. It was a risk, but she had to know. She had to understand the layout of this place. It was her only chance. Back in the shadows beside Bren, she opened the notebook. The pages were filled not with maps, but with cramped, frantic writing. A diary. The entries were disjointed, the handwriting deteriorating over time. Day 17, they are building something deep below. The noise is constant. Grick says it's the heart of the mountain. He's gone mad, I think. He talks of green blood and stone veins. Day 34 saw them take Lauren today. He was my friend. They didn't kill him. They plugged him in. There are pipes like the ones for the soup, but these are for something else. They call it the Zog juice. It makes the bigger ones stronger, faster. Day 51, I understand now. The mountain is alive. It's an orc thing. It grows. We are its food. The Grindas are its teeth. The forges are its breath. The green rock is its soul. I don't know. I'm so tired. The taste is always in my mouth. I think I tasted Grick today. The final entry was a single, scrawled sentence, the ink blotted with what might have been tears or blood. There is no escape. Only the grind. Ilara closed the notebook, her hands trembling. This was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just a machine. The entire fortress was a single, monstrous, semi-living entity, a biomechanical horror fueled by recycled life, and they were talking about a Zog juice made from slaves, something that enhanced the orcs themselves. She looked at Bren's feverish form. She thought of the diary's author, his sanity unraveling in this very room. The despair in the final entry was a palpable force, threatening to crush her will, but then she thought of the map she had drawn in her mind. The forges here, the mines there, the waste chutes leading down, the pipes leading up. The grindas were below. The heart of the horror was below. And she had just acquired a crucial piece of intelligence. The filters got clogged. It was a tiny, insignificant flaw in a system of overwhelming power, but a crack was all you needed for a flood to begin. A single misplaced rock could start an avalanche. She had until tomorrow. She would use the time. She would find a way to clog the system, to break the grind. It was a suicidal plan, but it was a plan. It was better than waiting to be soup. She leaned close to Bren's ear, her voice a determined whisper. Hold on, Bren, just hold on. I have an idea. The thump, thump, thump from below seemed to grow louder, as if in challenge. Chapter 3. The night was long and filled with the sounds of suffering. Bren drifted in and out of consciousness, his mutterings a nonsensical tapestry of farm, life and the terrors of Dar. Crush. Ilara did what she could, using a little of their water ration to cool his brow. The fever was a fire inside him, and she feared it would consume him before the orcs could. As the deep night watch changed, a new orc stomped past the infirmary entrance. This one was smaller, leaner than Grisgit, with one ear missing and a pronounced limp. He carried a heavy club but lacked the malicious energy of the other guards. He seemed bored. Ilara saw an opportunity. She had to be careful. Orcs respected strength, but they could also be manipulated by novelty. As he passed again, she spoke up, her voice deliberately calm, not pleading. The noise from below, she said. The big grinda. It has a whine in its bearing, doesn't it? On the downstroke. The orc guard stopped, turning his lumpy head towards her. His beady eyes narrowed. What you know about bearings, Umi? I know machines, Ilara lied, putting on a show of confidence. It was a desperate bluff. Her knowledge was from observing, from the diary, from connecting dots. My clan were builders. Before. She gestured vaguely at the fortress around them. I can hear the strain. A whine like that means a bearing is dry. It's starting to seize. If it locks up, the whole drive shaft could snap. She was stringing together technical terms she'd heard the mechanics use, hoping it sounded convincing. The orc, whose name was Snaga, scratched his head with his club. Sways, that's bad. Boss Zogwart would do his nut if they. Big Grinda stopped. He peered at her with a dawning, slow-witted curiosity. You ain't like the other Yumis. They just cry and stink. I am useful, Ilara said, echoing her earlier argument to Grisgit. A seized bearing means no soup. No soup means weak daka. Weak daka means a weak wach. She used the ultimate orc word, the word for their holy crusade of violence. It was a gamble of monumental proportions. Snaga's eyes widened. A weak wa was the greatest sin imaginable. He looked down the corridor towards the source of the thump, 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 now listening with a new, concerned ear. It does have a whine, don't it? He muttered almost to himself. I thought it was just the usual complaining. It will get worse, Ilara pressed. It needs oil. The thick black oil from the squig presses, not the thin stuff. She was making it up now entirely, but she remembered the orc engineers talking about different oils. Snaga grunted. I'll mention it to the mech boys in the morning. He started to turn away. They might not listen, Ilara said quickly. They are proud. They might think you are criticizing their work. She was playing on orc social dynamics. The mechs were a touchy, arrogant lot. Snaga stopped again, considering this. He was a lowly guard. A mech boy would likely just punch him for his trouble. But if you were to fix it yourself... Ilara let the sentence hang. Me, I ain't no mech. You wouldn't need to be. Just a bucket of the right oil, poured into the intake port on the main housing. You would be the one who saved the big Grinda, the one who ensured the Wach was strong. There would be extra rations for you, maybe a better weapon. She was painting a picture of glory for him, a path to elevation in the brutal orc hierarchy. It was a pathetic prize by human standards, but for an orc like Snagga it was everything. She could see the gears turning in his head, slow and rusty, but turning. Greed and fear of a weak while warring with his innate laziness. "I'll think about it," Snagga grunted, and resumed his patrol, but his step was more thoughtful now. Alara slumped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a ridiculously long shot, but it was something. She had planted a seed. If Snagga actually did it and used the wrong thick oil, might it gum up the works? Might it cause the seizure she had invented? It was a fragile hope, but it was the only one she had. As the first hints of a foul, greasy dawn filtered through the high vents, Bren's fever broke. He woke drenched in sweat, but his eyes were clear. The pain was still there, a constant agony, but the raging fire inside him had subsided. "Ilara?" he croaked. "I'm here," she said, relief washing over her. He tried to move his leg and winced. "It's still attached." "Barely," she said, managing a weak smile. The moment of fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Grisgut. The massive overseer filled the doorway, his hook hand tapping impatiently against the stone frame. "Well, is Dayumi fixed, or is it soup time?" Ilara helped Bren to his feet. He cried out as he put weight on the injured leg, his face turning ashen, but he managed to stand, leaning heavily on her in the wall. "He walks," Ilara said, her voice flat. Grisgut looked disappointed for a second, then shrugged. "Fine. Back to work then, but he's on mine duty, if he can't keep up. He goes into soup anyway." He unchained them from the infirmary wall and shoved them back into the main flow of slaves heading to the mines. As they were herded down the familiar tunnel, Ilara kept her eyes and ears open. She saw Snagga talking animatedly to another guard, pointing down towards the lower levels. Had he taken the bait? The work in the mines was even more brutal than before. Bren could do little more than sit and sort smaller rocks, each movement sending jolts of pain through his body. Ilara took on double the load, trying to compensate, her muscles screaming in protest. During a brief water break, a single ladle of brackish water from a rusty barrel, she overheard two grots whining to each other. "The big Grinda's making a right old racket now," one squeaked. "Oh, kerchunk, kerchunk!" Snagga sees he fixed it with some special oil, but now it's worse. "The mech boys is gonna be right cross," the other grot replied. "They's already shouting about a viscosity issue. Whatever that means." Alara's heart leapt. He'd done it. Snagga had actually done it, and he'd used the wrong oil. The machine was complaining. It was a small victory, a tiny act of sabotage, but it proved the system wasn't infallible. It could be disrupted. The thump-thump-thump had indeed changed. It was now a thump-screech-thump, a discordant, painful sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. The orcs seemed agitated by it. The rhythm of their world was off. It was during the last hour of the shift that the opportunity she had been waiting for presented itself. The discordant grinding from below reached a crescendo, followed by a loud bang and a sudden shocking silence. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had ever been. For a full 3 seconds, the entire fortress was quiet. Then chaos erupted. Orcs roared in confusion and anger. Alarms, crude metal gongs being hammered, began to clang. The mech boys, a mob of them covered in tools and grime, came stampeding past the mineshaft, heading down towards the Grindas, shouting about catastrophic failure and who zogged what. In the confusion, the overseers were distracted, yelling at each other, trying to figure out what was happening. This was it. The crack in the dam. Ilara grabbed Bren. "Now. Come on." "Where?" he asked, bewildered. "The waste chutes," she hissed, dragging him towards the back of the mine. She had memorized the location of the main waste chute from her mental map. It was a dark, foul-smelling opening in the rock, where grots dumped wheelbarrows of metallic refuse. The chute was steep, dark, and reeked of decay and ozone. It was a one-way ticket down into the belly of the beast, but it was unguarded. No orc would ever think a slave would willingly go towards the Grindas. "We'll die down there," Bren whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "We're dead if we stay here," Alara countered, her voice fierce. "This is our only chance. While they're fixing the machine, we can, I don't know, find a weakness, something." She helped Bren climb into the mouth of the chute. It was slick with unidentifiable grime. They shared a last terrified look. There was no going back. Together they pushed off, sliding down into the impenetrable darkness, towards the silent, wounded heart of the horror. The fall was a nightmare of scraping against rough metal and rock, of tumbling through absolute blackness, the air growing hotter and thicker with each passing second. They landed with a jarring thud in a deep pile of soft, yielding material. It was warm. It shifted unpleasantly beneath them, as Alara's eyes adjusted to the faint, phosphorescent glow of lichen on the walls. She saw what they had landed in. It was a mountain of discarded clothing, all of it torn and stained. Human clothing, a graveyard of rags from 1,000 different slaves, the last remnants of their identities before they were fed into the machine. They were in the recycling pit, and ahead of them, in the sudden eerie silence, lay the vast, complex, and now stalled machinery of the Grindas. Chapter 4. The silence was absolute and unnerving. After weeks of the relentless thump, 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 its absence was a physical pressure on Alara's eardrums. The air in the vast chamber was hot, humid, and carried a stench that was indescribable, a mixture of a slaughterhouse, a tanner's yard, and that same fungal, organic reek of the orcs themselves, but amplified 1,000 times. They had landed in the rag pile, a soft, tragic dune at the edge of a cavern so enormous its ceiling was lost in darkness. The chamber was the source of the green glow that permeated to crush. It didn't come from torches or forges, but from the very machinery itself. The Grindas were not a single machine, but a complex, interconnected system that filled the cavern. Massive, piston-driven hammers now still hung over deep pits. Conveyor belts made of thick, hide-like material lay dormant, leading to vats large enough to swallow a house. A tangled web of pipes, some pulsing with a faint internal light, crisscrossed the space, connecting everything. The central feature was a colossal, drum-like structure easily 100 feet across, from which the main drive shaft, now motionless, led upwards. This was the Big Grinda, the heart of the operation, and it was all built into and seemingly grown from the living rock of the mountain. Veins of green rock pulsed within the walls and floor, providing both structure and power. The whole place felt less like a factory and more like the internal organ of some colossal sleeping beast. By the ancestors, Bren breathed, his face a mask of horror as he took it all in. He pointed a trembling finger. "Look." Following his gaze, Alara saw the intake. It was a wide, ramp-like conveyor belt that led down from a heavy iron door high on the far wall, and the door through which slaves like Kale were brought. The belt ended over a large, grinding maw filled with rotating, tooth-like crushers. That was the first stage. Beyond that, the material was carried by screw conveyors through a series of heating and chemical vats, the soup makers. She could see the large glass portholed pipes leading away from these vats, carrying the nutrient-rich slurry upwards to feed the slaves and, she guessed, to nourish the strange orcoid fungi that grew in patches throughout the fortress. But there were other outputs. A series of smaller, more intricate pipes, glowing with a more intense green light, ran from a separate set of pressurized vats. This, she realized with a chill, must be the Zog juice the diary had mentioned. The substance that enhanced the orcs. It was a distillate of slave essence, a concentrated life force. And finally, the solid waste, the bones, the teeth, the bits that wouldn't break down, were shunted onto another conveyor that fed into a great sintering machine. It superheated the bone and mineral matter, fusing it with the raw ore of the mountain to create the glowing green rock. It was a perfect, closed, and utterly horrifying system. Nothing was wasted. Everything was recycled. "It's a stomach," Alara whispered, the analogy becoming terrifyingly clear. "The whole mountain, it's a stomach, and we're the food." The sudden silence was broken by the sound of approaching voices, loud, angry orc voices. The mech boys were coming to fix the breakdown. "We have to hide," Alara said, pulling Bren from the rag pile. They scrambled behind a large coolant tank, its surface warm and vibrating slightly with residual heat. A mob of a dozen mech boys, led by a particularly large orc with a welding mask fused to his face and a powerful hydraulic claw for one arm, stormed into the chamber. They gathered around the big grinda, their shouts echoing in the vast space. "It's seized solid," one yelled, whacking the massive drum with a wrench. Snagga said he put in special oil. Another roared. "That stupid git. He used day gearbox gunk. It's thicker than a squiggoth's snot. It's gummed up the whole primary drive." The lead mech, whom the others called Doc Zapgib, let out a furious bellow. "Get it cleaned out now! Boss Zogwart will have our teeth if the soup stops for long. And check the filters. They'll be packed." The mech sprang into action, swarming over the giant machine with blowtorches and large solvent sprays. The chamber filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and orc sweat. Ilara and Bren watched from their hiding spot, their hearts pounding. This was their chance. While the mechs were focused on the big grinda, they could explore, look for a permanent way to disable the system. "The filters," Ilara whispered to Bren. "The diary said they get clogged. And the mechs just mentioned them. If we could clog them beyond cleaning, maybe with something they can't just burn or dissolve." Bren's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. "What, the rags? Maybe, but we need something more substantial." Her eyes scanned the chamber, past the bats and conveyors, and landed on a pile of discarded tools near a maintenance alcove. Among them were several large, heavy spanners and, more importantly, a length of thick fibrous cable, likely used for hauling. It was as thick as her arm and looked incredibly tough. "That cable," she said. "If we could get it into the intake into the crushers, it would jam it for good," Bren finished, a grim understanding dawning on his face. "But how? The intake is all." "The way over there." He gestured across the open floor of the chamber. It was a 20-yard dash across open ground, fully visible to the mechs working on the big grinda. It was suicide. "We wait for a distraction," Ilara said. They didn't have to wait long. As the mechs worked to free the seized bearing, there was a loud pop and a spray of hot, viscous fluid shot from a released pressure valve, dousing two of them. They roared in pain and surprise, stumbling back and crashing into a rack of tools, which clattered to the floor with an enormous racket. The other mechs shouted and crowded around, some laughing, others yelling in anger. It was now or never. "Go!" Ilara hissed. She and Bren burst from their hiding place and sprinted, or in Bren's case hobbled desperately, across the open floor towards the maintenance alcove. Every footfall echoed in her ears. She expected a shout of discovery at any second. They reached the pile of tools panting. Ilara grabbed the end of the heavy cable. It was immensely heavy, a dead weight. Bren, despite his leg, put his shoulder into it, and together they began to drag it, coiling it as they went, back towards the intake conveyor. The distraction at the big grinda was still ongoing. The two oil-soaked mechs were now fighting each other, while Doc Zapgib was trying to break it up, shouting about wasted time. Ilara and Bren reached the base of the intake ramp. The crusher maw yawned above them, a silent pit of blunt, rusty teeth. The smell here was overpowering, old blood and decay. "Up the ramp," Ilara grunted. It was a Herculean effort. Bren was pale, sweat pouring down his face from the agony of his leg. Ilara's muscles screamed in protest. They hauled the cable up the steep incline, inch by tortuous inch. They were halfway up when a sharp voice cut through the din. "Oi, what's that?" One of the mechs, a smaller one who had been fetching a tool, was staring right at them from across the chamber. Time seemed to freeze. The mech's jaw dropped open in astonishment. Then his face contorted with rage. "Umi's into Grinda room." All activity at the big Grinda stopped. A dozen pairs of piggy, furious eyes turned towards them. Doc Zapgib shoved his way to the front. "Get him!" he bellowed. The mob of mechs, forgetting their repair work, charged. "Push it in!" Ilara screamed to Bren. With a final desperate heave, they shoved the coiled mass of the heavy cable into the mouth of the crusher. It landed with a dull thud, jamming perfectly between the massive grinding teeth. The orcs were almost upon them. There was no escape back down the ramp. Alara looked around wildly. Next to the crusher was the opening for the main waste pipe. The same one she had seen from above. The one that pulsed with the green soup. The porthole was there, showing the thick churning liquid within. It was a pipe of nightmares, but it was the only way. The pipe! We have to go in the pipe, she yelled. Bren looked at her as if she were mad. It'll grind us up. It's stalled. The whole system is off. It's just a tube now. It's our only chance. The first of the mechs had reached the base of the ramp and was starting up. A massive wrench raised high. There was no more time for debate. Alara grabbed Bren and, together, they used a loose piece of machinery as a step and hurled themselves at the pipe. She slammed against the thick glass of the porthole, while Bren clung to a valve next to her. Zep-Gib reached the top of the ramp, his hydraulic claw whirring.
Think you can break my machine, Umi?
He snarled. You're gonna be day first ones through when we get it started again. He lunged at them. Alara, acting on pure instinct, brought her foot up and kicked with all her might at them. Porthole's locking mechanism, it was a weak point. A thought whispered from her cartographer's soul, a point of failure. To her astonishment, the old corroded lock burst open. The pressure of the stagnant soup behind it blew the porthole door outward with a wet, sucking sound. A wave of the thick green, foul-smelling liquid sloshed out, drenching Zep-Gib and knocking him off balance. He slipped on the slick surface and fell with a roar of surprise, tumbling back down the ramp into his fellow mechs. The open porthole yawned before them, a dark, wet circle leading into the unknown. Now! Alara shouted. She didn't give Bren a chance to protest. She shoved him into the opening and scrambled in after him. They landed in a shallow flow of the cold, viscous soup, inside a pipe that was just wide enough to crawl through. The stench was unbearable, a concentrated version of the gruel they were forced to eat. Behind them they could hear the furious bellows of the orcs, but they were inside the system's veins, a place no orc would ever fit and no slave had ever been. They began to crawl, pushing against the slight stagnant current, moving away from the Grinda chamber, deeper into the mountain circulatory system, into the very guts of the horror. The pipe was a tunnel of absolute darkness and suffocating stench. The only light came from the faint, sickly green glow of the soup itself, which coated everything in a slimy, phosphorescent film. They moved in a desperate, hunched-over crawl, their hands and knees slipping in the thick sludge. The air was thin and foul, making every breath a struggle. Alara led the way, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. They had done it. They had jammed the primary machine, but they were now trapped inside the digestive tract of a living fortress. Where did this pipe lead? To the holding vats? To the forges? To somewhere even worse? Bren was lagging behind, his injured leg making every movement pure torture. His breathing was ragged, punctuated by grunts of pain. We have to keep moving, Alara urged, her voice a hoarse whisper in the confined space. They'll be trying to restart the Grindas. If they get the crushers working again. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The image of that cable and themselves being ground into pulp was motivation enough. They crawled for what felt like an eternity. The pipe branched several times and Alara, using her innate sense of direction, always chose the path that seemed to lead upwards, away from the Grinda chamber. Up meant potential escape, or at least a chance to find another part of the fortress. Finally, they saw a dim light ahead, not the green glow of the soup, but the flickering orange of torchlight. They slowed their approach, moving as quietly as they could. The pipe ended in a grated outlet, overlooking another vast chamber. This one was different. It was hotter, drier, and filled with the roar of immense fires and the deafening clang of hammers on metal. The forges. They were looking down from a high ledge, hidden in the shadows, onto the main forge level of Decrush. It was a scene from an industrial hell. Massive, orc-sized anvils stood like islands in the sea of soot and sparks. Crucibles of molten metal, glowing with the distinctive green hue of the processed ore, were poured by teams of slaves under the watchful eyes of orc taskmasters. The weapons being forged were brutal, ugly things, huge shootas, choppas with serrated edges and other, more esoteric engines of war. But Alara's attention was drawn to the center of the chamber. There a particularly massive orc, even larger than Grizget, presided over the work. He was a monstrous figure, clad in jagged plates of scrap metal that had been fused into a semblance of armor. One of his arms was a crude, powerful bionic, and a heavy, iron-shod boot encased one foot. Wires and tubes ran from his back into a large, backpack-like device that pulsed with the same green light as the Zog juice pipes. This had to be Boss Zogwart, and he was furious. A mech boy was cowering before him, explaining the breakdown in the Grindis.
"And to Umi's boss."
They jammed it good with a load of cable. "It'll take hours to cut it out." Zogwart's roar shook the very foundations of the forge. Hours. He backhanded the mech, sending him flying across the chamber. "No soup for hours?" He stomped his iron-shod foot, cracking the stone floor. "Dawa cannot wait. We have a big fight coming. We need Dadaka." He paced like a caged animal, his bionic fist clenching and unclenching. "No soup means weak grots. Weak boys, weak Daka." He stopped and pointed a thick, green finger at the terrified mechs. "I don't care how you do it. Get it fixed. Use it to back up. The backup ain't been used in ages, boss." Another mech whined. "The pipes is probably clogged." "Then unclog 'em!" Zogwart screamed, spittle flying from his tusked mouth. "I want that soup flowing again before the sun sets, or I'll feed you lot to the Grindas personally." "Now get out of my sight!" The mech scrambled away. Zogwart turned his rage on the slaves and orcs at the forges. "What you lot staring at?"
"Get back to work!"
"More Daka!" The clanging and roaring resumed with renewed intensity. Alara and Bren shrank back into the pipe. The backup, there was another system? The thought was chilling. "We have to find it," Alara whispered. "We have to stop that too." "How?" Bren asked, his voice thick with exhaustion and despair. "We're trapped in a pipe, Alara. We're covered in us. We have no weapons. No strength left." "We have our minds," Alara said, though her own hope was fraying. "And we have something they don't. We're inside their walls. We see the parts they forget about." She looked around their cramped, filthy hiding place. The pipe they were in was a primary artery for the soup, but smaller pipes branched off from it, feeding different parts of the fortress. One such pipe, narrower than the rest, had a steady, slow drip of a clearer, but still faintly green liquid. It smelled less of decay and more of chemicals and ozone. The Zog juice line. An idea began to form in her mind. A terrible, desperate idea. "The orcs. They run on belief, right?" she said, thinking out loud. "Their machines work because they think they should." Bren just stared at her, uncomprehending. What if we could break that belief? Not just break a machine, but break the idea of the machine? How do you break an idea? "You show them it's poisoned," Alara said, her eyes hardening as she looked at the dripping Zog juice pipe. "You show them that their strength, their power, comes from a source that has been corrupted." She reached out and caught a drop of the Zog juice on her finger. It was warm and tingled unpleasantly. This was the concentrated essence of slaves, the stuff that made the bigger orcs like Zogwart even stronger. Faster, more resilient. She reached out and caught a drop of the Zog juice on her finger. It was warm and tingled unpleasantly. This was the concentrated essence of slaves, the stuff that made the bigger orcs like Zogwart even stronger. Faster, more resilient. "We need to get into that pipe," she said. "We need to put something in it." "Put what in it?" "We have nothing." Ilara looked at the filthy, soup-coated rags they wore. She looked at Bren's leg, at the festering, infected wound. She looked at her own hands, caked in grime and filth. "We have disease," she said quietly. "We have rot. We have the corruption of this place on us and in us." It was a monstrous thought. To deliberately poison the well. To introduce sickness into a system that fed on life. But this was a war of survival. And the orcs had already turned their bodies into a resource. This was just repurposing that resource one final time. "We'll make them sick," Bren whispered, understanding dawning, his eyes wide with a kind of horrified awe. "We'll poison the Zog juice." "It might not work," Alara admitted. "Their biology is tough. But it's a chance. If we can make even a few of the big ones weak, if we can make Zogwart himself falter, it could cause chaos. It could break their spirit. It was a plan born of utter desperation, a final, spiteful act of sabotage from the very fuel the machine consumed. They found a weak joint in the smaller Zog juice pipe, a section that was less welded and more clumsily hammered together. Using a sharp piece of scrap metal they found lodged in the main pipe, they worked at the seam, prying and levering until they created a small leaking gap. Then they set about the grim task. They soaked the foulest, most pus-stained strips of cloth from Bren's bandages in the stagnant soup. They scraped the filth from their own skin and packed it into the leak. They were introducing a cocktail of human bacteria and decay into the orcs' enhancement serum. It was a slow, messy, and revolting process, but with every handful of corruption they shoved into the pipe, Ilara felt a small, cold sense of satisfaction. They were fighting back. They were turning the orcs' own recycling process against them. They had just finished patching the leak as best they could with a wad of hardened, tar-like substance they found nearby when they heard a sound that froze their blood. From the depths of the pipe behind them, from the direction of the grindas, came a low groaning, grinding sound. Then a thump, a single labored thump, followed by another. The mechs had gotten the backup system online. The grindas were starting up again. The thump-screech-thump began anew, but this time it was different, more strained, as if the machine itself were in pain. The cable jam was still there and the backup system was struggling against it, but it was working. The soup in their pipe began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The stagnant flow became a current pulling at their legs. The system is pressurizing. Ilara cried, "We have to get out of here." They scrambled back towards the grated outlet overlooking the forges. But the current was strengthening, threatening to sweep them off their feet and carry them back down into the reactivated grindas. Ilara grabbed the grate, her fingers turning white with the strain. Bren clung to her. Below they could see the orcs cheering as the torches seemed to burn brighter. As the forges roared with renewed vigor, the soup was flowing. The Wa was back on track. But then something else happened. Boss Zogwart, who had been watching the resumption of work with a satisfied grunt, suddenly staggered. He clutched at his chest, his massive frame swaying. A fit of wet, racking cough seized him, and he spat a glob of black phlegm onto the floor. He shook his head as if to clear it. "What does Zog?" he muttered. At another anvil, a large orc blacksmith suddenly dropped his hammer, his green skin looking pale and waxy. He vomited violently, a stream of black bile. A ripple of unease went through the forge. Orcs didn't get sick. It was unheard of. The poison was working. Ilara and Bren watched, clinging to the grate as the current tugged at them. They had done it. They had introduced a flaw not just in the machine but in the orcs themselves. But their victory was short-lived. The strain on the backup system was too much. With a final shrieking groan of tortured metal from deep below, followed by an earth-shattering boom, the thump-screech-thump stopped altogether. This time the silence felt final. And then the entire mountain began to shake. Chapter 6. The explosion from the Grinda chamber was catastrophic. It wasn't just a machine breaking down. It was a catastrophic failure that triggered a chain reaction through the biomechanical system of Decrush. The mountain was indeed alive in a way, and they had just given it a lethal stroke. The pipe Ilara and Bren were clinging to shuddered violently. Cracks appeared in the metal, spraying them with jets of hot soup and steam. The grate they were holding onto tore loose from the wall, and they were flung out into the open air of the forge chamber. They landed hard on a pile of coal and slag, the impact driving the air from their lungs. All around them was chaos. The forge was in an uproar. The explosion had ruptured fuel lines and coolant tanks. Green fire spread across the floor. Orcs were running in every direction, not in organized response but in blind panic. The fundamental order of their world was collapsing. Boss Zogwart was on his knees, still coughing, his bionic arms sparking erratically. The poison was ravaging his system, and the destruction of his fortress was breaking his will. He looked around at the crumbling forges, his sickened warriors, and let out a roar of pure, impotent fury that was drowned out by the sound of falling rock. "The mountain is coming down," Bren yelled, pulling Alara to her feet. The ceiling of the forge chamber was fracturing, huge chunks of stone and green rock crashing down, crushing orcs and machinery alike. The primary support structure of Decrush, integrally linked to the Grindas, was failing. "This way!" Alara shouted, pulling Bren towards a secondary tunnel she had noted during her earlier observations. It was a supply route used by grots to bring raw ore, and it sloped upwards. They ran, or rather stumbled and limped through the pandemonium. The world was ending in fire and green lightning. Orcs fought each other in their confusion and rage. Some, in a final act of mindless violence, turned on their weakened comrades. The Great Wa was devouring itself. They passed the slave pens. The doors had been shattered in the explosions. The few surviving slaves were pouring out, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, unbelievable hope. They saw Alara and Bren, two filthy, bloodied figures leading the way, and followed them in a desperate, scrambling river of humanity. Alara led them up the sloping tunnel, her cartographer's mind providing a ghost of a map, a memory of a path to the outside. They passed through halls they had once been marched through in chains, now filled with smoke and collapsing debris. Behind them, the heart of Decrush died with a final grinding shriek. The thump, thump, thump was gone, replaced by the roar of a mountain in its death throes. They burst out of a wide entrance tunnel, stumbling into the cold, clean air of the Cinderstone Mountains. The night sky, speckled with sharp, uncaring stars, had never looked more beautiful. Behind them, the fortress vomited smoke and fire into the sky, its internal structure collapsing with a series of deafening booms. They didn't stop. They pushed on, the group of freed slaves, maybe 24, out of the hundreds who had been imprisoned, staggering, away from the dying mountain, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the nightmare. They finally collapsed, exhausted, in a sheltered gully a mile away. They watched as, with the final, titanic rumble, the entire face of the mountain slumped inwards, burying Decrush, the Grindas, Boss Zogwart, and the entire horrific recycling system under millions of tons of rock. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of a world without the grinding green. Alara sat on a rock, shivering in the cold night air. Bren lay on the ground beside her, finally allowing himself to pass out from pain and exhaustion. The other slaves huddled together, weeping, laughing, staring into the distance in shock. They were free. They had survived. But as Alara looked at her hands, still caked in the filth of the pipes, and thought of the metallic taste that would probably haunt her dreams forever, she knew that a part of them would always be in that mountain. They had escaped its guts, but they carried the memory of its digestion within them. They had not just destroyed a fortress. They had killed the idea that they were merely fuel, resources to be consumed and recycled. They had proven that even the smallest, most consumed thing could choke the machine that devoured it. She looked up at the stars, taking a deep, clean breath of air, untainted by ozone and decay. They were free, and as the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon, she knew that the story of the grinding green was over. But the story of their survival was just beginning.